I am Matthew Baker from ProSymmetry, and I'll be leading today's discussion around what-if scenario in practice. So I do thank everybody for joining today, and over the course of today's webinar, we're going to be covering some of the different options that you have available to you within what-if, as well as maybe some particular scenarios that you can do when you're within the what-if scenario planning tool, how to interact with the information that you're pulling over, making sure everything's being pulled over correctly, and then some of those different options you can do when running those different scenarios. So as we go through today's webinar, if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to put them in the chat, and then once we wrap up towards the end, we can go through and have some time to discuss those questions that were asked. Okay, so with that being said, I'm going to jump in today's webinar, which is going to be the what-if scenario in practice. So if everybody can see my screen, I'm on my Tempus homepage right here. I have some data in here on my projects and resources. And to navigate to the what-if scenario, all you have to do is go to this Tempus what-if, and this will bring you to a new tab that shows you all the models that you have created as well as you have access to. So today's purpose for today's webinar is not to go through all the different configuration options. Many of those people on today probably have gone through and have seen. They will be more so on the focus of the different options you have when you're actually have everything configured, as well as giving you the options to kind of change, manipulate, and run some of those different scenarios that you may be interested in. So I will go ahead and create a new model here, and we'll briefly go over some of the most important configuration options that I think it is important, and it does kind of change the way that the information is being displayed in your model. And I'll cover those as well, but very quickly I'm going to go through some of these major or more straightforward options that we have, such as name. I'll just name this model 9/29/2021. I'll keep my private option here. I'll go through and just provide a start date. I'll make this go out for 3 years. I'll aggregate my information by the department my resources belong to. I'll add this current phase as my priority custom field as well, and that will kind of do it for the top settings, but I do want to spend a little bit of time on some of these project-based settings, because I know as I've done some trainings with some of our clients, and depending on the person, these can get a little confusing, and it sometimes can be difficult to understand what exactly everything here is doing. So I do want to take some time to cover these options, just because they very much will impact how your information is being pulled over and what information you are seeing within the model itself. So the first option I just want to cover here, which is pretty straightforward, is going to be the include partial projects. And just so everybody's aware, a partial project is a project that just doesn't fit entirely within this time frame that you specified up above. So these are going to be projects that, in this case, start before 1/1/2021 or end after 1/1/2024. However, the last part of that is they do have allocation at some point in between this time frame. So there is allocation assigned to this, to a partial project during this time. They just happen to fall outside the boundaries of the given time frame up above. So you can see right now, when I have this excluded or include partial projects disabled, we will see that my projects are 16 out of 16, and all of these projects would essentially completely fit within the boundaries of 1/1/2021 and 1/1/2024. However, if I were to go ahead and include partial projects, we will, most cases, you see this project number jump up. We are now seeing 41 out of 41, and that's just meaning that there's around 25 or so projects that have time during this time frame, however, don't completely fit within here. So this is typically an option I see enabled in most scenarios. There may be specific use cases, such as you only want to focus on projects that fit within here. Anything that's outside those boundaries don't need to be touched. And if that is the case, you can absolutely choose to disable this option and work with your information that way. That does make it so there is a little bit less information. You're really isolating the projects that you want to focus on. However, just want to make sure everyone is aware of this option and what's kind of happening behind the scenes. And the next two options on the project side, which are also very important, will essentially determine what projects are coming over, as well as if you can interact with the projects. So the two options we have here is the dynamic project inclusion, as well as unselected project resource allocation. So let's go ahead and just deselect this one first and start with this dynamic project inclusion option. So as you can see down below, I have 41 out of 41 projects, and I have no kind of capability to actually deselect them. So I can go down here, I can try to remove them. However, every time I hover over one of these selection options or these checkboxes, we just get this kind of display that I can't actually perform that action. And that is purely because we have this dynamic project inclusion option enabled. So what this does essentially is going to force in the projects that fit within this time frame, and you don't really have control on which ones you can and cannot put in there. However, if I were to deselect this, then it gives you those options where you can actually select the projects that you wish to see within the model down below. So I will say in most scenarios, I do see dynamic project inclusion enabled as an option for our clients, bringing in all that project information. And there's primarily two reasons why I think that is and why it's important to have this option on if this is kind of the scenario you're running through, and that has to do with one, dynamic project inclusion does automatically bring in new projects as they are created within Tempus. So let's say, for example, you have your current model, you've created it, and then you go through maybe another process where you add 5, 6, maybe 10 more projects into the system, and you want to see how that impacts your information within the model. Instead of having to go in here and reselect those 10 projects that you just added to have them populate, this will make it so they automatically populate within there, and you won't actually have to go through and change the configuration whatsoever. So it's very important if those are some of the scenarios you're running through and you want your information to populate that way, to do and have this option enabled. And two, one of the things that also comes into play with this dynamic project inclusion is the filtering capabilities. So right now we have no filters applied. That's why we're seeing 41 out of 41. However, we can apply filters to further separate out the information that we're looking to see within here. So in this case, even though we have this option, dynamic project inclusion enabled, we can always go down here and we can filter by maybe the phase of the project. And maybe we want to see only projects that are in phase 1. And go ahead and add that filter in. Now we're only going to be working with those 10 or so projects. We don't have all 41 out of 41 being pulled in. And we can see that we still have this enabled, and this will make it so in this case, if you only want to focus on projects in phase 1, anytime a project in phase 1 is added into Tempus, it should populate within the model, and you shouldn't have to ever change the configuration options within here. So it is a good quality of a life option to make sure that whenever you open a model, you should be expecting the most up-to-date information within the system, as well as still see the changes that have been made. So that brings us to the last option we have in here, and I also think this is one of the most important options, which is the unselected project resource allocation. So let's say we go ahead and we have our filter applied, and we have maybe it's showing these 10 projects or so, and let's go ahead and leave this option disabled. So I'm going to go ahead, save this model, and save the configuration. I'm going to go ahead and open this up. So like you would expect, we have our Gant bars at the top for those 10 projects, as well as we have a heat map generated based off our aggregates within here. However, in this scenario, all we are seeing is the allocation that is associated to these 10 projects up above. So there are definitely scenarios where this is helpful. Maybe you only want to focus on your team, and you know they only are assigned to maybe projects in a particular phase or something that is assigned to a particular role or department, and you can absolutely do so. Really help isolate on the information that you have within those projects. But what happens when you have projects that or the resources that you're managing or looking into are assigned across multiple projects that don't belong to that filter that we applied. So maybe in this case, we have projects we're looking in project for phase 1. However, what if some of the resources we're interested in are assigned to projects in the phase 2 or phase 3 or phase 4, ones that have not been included in that filter? We have no visibility with that at this point in time on that information down below. All we're seeing is current phase 1. If we drill into here, we're going to see this information, and there's always the potential that a user is unaware of the filtering. They see this and they're seeing, whoa, all of our resources within these different departments are under allocated. What's going on? why are they under allocated, what needs to be changed, could we add more projects, and can lead to that false positive conclusion that everything looks under allocated, this is not okay, just because they don't have a full understanding of all the allocation in the system. And so that brings us to the option that I was just talking about. And let me go ahead and head back and go to my configuration option. And that's going to bring us to this unselected project resource allocation option. So when this is enabled, essentially we're going to have a slightly different grid display. Instead of just seeing the projects for the 10 projects down below that were selected that are in phase 1, we're actually going to see all project allocation within the allocation grid down below. The top grid, or the top section with the Gant charts and the resource grid, those will remain the same regardless of this option being selected. However, the bottom resource allocation grid that shows the heat maps and the different metrics of your information will essentially include all of the allocation that would typically fall within this boundary. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to hit save right here. And next time when we open this up, we should see a drastically different story here, giving us a more accurate reflection of the allocation in our system. So one of the things that is important to know is what is the difference between what we would have seen if we had no filters applied and what we are seeing now. So in the case if we had no filters applied, up above, we would have essentially all of the projects in our system displayed as Gantt bars, and we'd have all the allocation. However, in this case, we are only seeing these 10 or so projects up above as Gantt, and then down below, we're still seeing all our allocation. So when the option is enabled, if we were to drill into here, let's say we click into one of our projects, you're going to see your allocation split up into two different segments. You're going to have your allocation that can be simulated, represented by this kind of blue pie chart over here on the right in the utilization. And then if we scroll down, we're going to see some of these orange cannot be simulated. And those are going to be represented by this orange pie chart over here on the right for utilization percentage. So essentially any of the projects in blue up above, we can see they have a Gantt representation, and you can start manipulating the information for that given project in this scenario. However, any of the ones in orange are essentially going to be projects that have not been included. We're still seeing the allocation, so we're not drawing that false positive. However, we'll have no capability to actually make edits. They're essentially going to be in here as a read-only information, just to make sure you're getting a full roll-up of the allocation within there. So I'm going to go ahead and make this a little bit easier. I'm going to go back to my configuration. I'm going to remove the filter that I had applied and just bring over all my projects. Still have that selected. But I hope that helps give you a better understanding of what that unselected project resource allocation option does. One that is very important, as well as it's doing it or setting up your model that way, so you have the filters applied and then unselected project allocation, really does help limit this top section of projects that are being displayed, because those can, as everyone knows, the amount of projects in your system can very easily get out of hand and drastically increase. And so instead of having, let's say maybe 20, or instead of having maybe 200, 300 projects being included, making it a little bit more difficult to navigate between the top screen, you can apply the filter, really isolate in on the projects that you're looking for, and then still make sure that you're including all the information and not drawing any of those false positives. So that's going to wrap up the configuration. I didn't want to spend too much time in here. We could definitely spend probably another 30 minutes going over those different options, but that is not the purpose for today. I just want to make sure I highlighted some of those key pieces of configuration that I see some of the users that I work with kind of struggle on and maybe draw some confusion on when they're configuring their model. So with that being said, now we're in the model, and this is where you'll be spending the majority of the work when you're doing when you set this up. And there is a lot of different options to start manipulating, playing with the information within here. So to start things off, I'm going to be going through some of those key pieces of functionality within here that allows you to kind of really manipulate the data and play with things, change things around. And then afterwards, once we go through some of those key pieces, we're going to be going through some of the different scenarios where you may want to use these, or what you may be thinking when you're playing around with some of these options. However, before I do that, I just want to make one thing clear when it comes to the information in your model, and that has to do with in regards to the way that the information is being represented and what happens to this information when you start essentially making some of these changes. So think of this Tempus model as kind of its own instance of these changes. However, every change that you do make in here does not reflect your live data. So if I were to go in here and I make a change to Apollo phase 14, let's say I just drag the slider over to the right a little bit, change the dates around. By doing that, that's going to change the information in the model. However, it will have no impact on the information in my live data. So if I were to go into my project and look for that Apollo phase 14 project, I would still see the same start and end date that I previously had, even though it is different within this model. So the changes that you make within here do not have any impact on the live information within Tempus. So you really do have kind of full reign to play around, mess around with the data, make some changes without having any concern about impacting information if it shouldn't be. So it's a very good place for you to, or for any user to go in, start playing around, making some changes, and get a better understanding of how their data flows and what's essentially being within the system, and see if it can be improved upon. So with that being said, I'm going to start by going over some of the key functionality within here, and we're going to start up here on the top side of the grid, and I'll just use this slider over here on the right to give us a little bit more space. And the first one will be just the Gant bars themselves. So in this case, we have a project, a Gant bar is going to be associated to a project, and you can see the name over here on the left. And when changing some of this information, majority of that will be done with the Gant bar itself. And you'll have essentially 3 options you can do within here. So one is if you click on the bar, you can go ahead and move it to the left or right. And that's going to be simulate a change in a project start and end date. So if a project, what if you have the case where you have a project or a handful of projects that need to be essentially moved out 6 months, you could essentially find this project. You see it starts on July 5th, 2021. And let's say we wanted to move it out. So it now starts on, let's say, the 1st of January 2022. So we can go ahead and move that over. And essentially that's going to be representing a shift in the project start date, and as well as end date. Or maybe you had a project that you previously proposed to start on January 1st, 2022. And then it needs to be essentially prioritized and started early. You can do the same thing by dragging the Gant bar over to the left. And as you do so, you can see that we have this modal window showing you kind of what the new from and to date will be, how many days it's being shifted. So a negative is going to be just if you're moving backwards, positive is going to be moving forwards, and you can simply drag and drop it into the new start date and then make that change. So as those changes are being made, you will also see in real time how your data is being impacted by the change, any allocation that would be updated from that change as well. And so you'll be able to see that with any of the bars that you remove depending on the allocation that is assigned. So if I do the same change, let's say we need to move assets database design out, you can see down below in the allocation grid, my allocation percentages are changing as well. And we'll just have this one start on June 2nd, 2021. So that's a very key option available within here, allow you to move the start and end dates around, as well as you'll also have the option to either expand or compress your projects within here. And that's going to be done by hovering over the project that you want to essentially work with. Let's say Apollo phase 14 again, and you will see we have these options on the left side of the bar as well as the right, which will essentially either expand the projects out, so essentially increasing the duration by selecting on it and moving to the left, to the right, or you can actually go ahead and go the opposite way. You can essentially shorten the duration of the project, and we can go along that way and see what that would look like. So when you do make those changes, you do see that the bars display this orange, just to let you know that a change to the start, or essentially the change of the duration, of the project has been made, and you can quickly identify that that has happened. And so very important, especially if maybe your project, you don't have as much time as you initially thought. Maybe you need to reprioritize and it needs to be done quicker, or maybe you're losing resources and the duration is going to essentially increase because you just don't have as much FTE to essentially work on the project. So a couple scenarios there to really work through, but it is important to know as well kind of how the calculation behind the scenes is happening, because sometimes you may need to increase essentially maybe expand a project, increase the duration, but on top of that, you also need to add additional hours to the project. You're not just expanding it out with the same amount of work being asked. Maybe you need to increase the amount of work being asked, or in the opposite fashion, decrease the amount of work. Maybe it's project's going smoother. We're not going to need the same amount of manpower as or FTE that we initially thought. You'll have option to do that as well. And that will be done if we go over here to the left and click on this kind of blue circle to the left of the project name. And then in the bottom, we'll have two options for our compression as well as expansion calculation. So by default, all your projects are essentially going to be going to have a fixed values calculation. So what does fixed values mean exactly? The fixed values is going to allow you to, or is essentially going to keep the fixed amount of allocation being asked for on that given project. And then as you expand or compress it, we're going to keep that fixed value within there and essentially just redistribute how many hours are going to be working on that given day. So let's say, for example, in Apollo phase 14, we had 1,000 hours being asked for throughout this duration. And we were to go here and let's say we decided to decrease the duration by 182 days and contract it to have that new end date and keep the same start date. So the amount of allocation being asked for on Apollo phase 14 is still that 1,000 hours. It's just now going to be compressed and essentially redistributed throughout a different time frame. And the same thing would happen is if we were to expand and increase the duration and move it out a couple months, we're going to still have that 1,000 hours being assigned here. It's just going to instead be redistributed, and it's just going to be less amount of work per day than initially asked for. However, we also have the option for a fixed percentage. And what a fixed percentage is going to do is at that point in time when this is enabled, we're going to keep a particular percentage of allocation being asked for. And then as we expand and compress, we're actually going to be increasing or decreasing the overall allocation being asked for on this project. So this is going to be particularly useful is if you need to go through and actually add allocation. Maybe you need to extend this out 3 months and we need the same amount of work being worked on this particular project just for 3 additional months. That's when you want to use this fixed percentage option. Make sure that you're increasing the amount, you're keeping the same amount of work consistently. It's just going to take some additional time. Whereas fixed values is more so used when you know you have a fixed amount of work that needs to be done here, and it's just determining if it will be done earlier or later than it needs to be. So both very important options, both very useful depending on the scenario that you're running through. And then the last thing on this, I just want to make sure that I reiterate is this does essentially or will default to fixed values for all your projects initially. So if you do need to change it, to go over it once more, you just have to click on this blue option over here on the left and then select on this fixed percentage down below. So outside of that, one more the last option that you really have within the bar area itself will be adding some constraints within here. So these are optional. You do not need to add these, but I do find them very helpful when you're working with multiple projects. You're trying to manage when a particular project must start, or maybe when a particular project must end, and then help you kind of identify where you can put and where you can actually have that project start. But when you do hover over this bar, if you hover over the top in this yellow bar above, you will see this kind of red down option showing you a date. And all that will do is showing you a constraint of a given project. So you can go ahead, you can click on it again to move it left or right and say, okay, well, I know this project must start at least on the 1st of April. We can go ahead and add that. And now if I were to try to move it past that, it's not going to allow me. So I can go over here, try to move it, but essentially it's saying this project must start at least on 4/1/2021. It cannot start before then, and the system will not allow you to do that. So you will also have the ability to add constraints on the right side as well. So if this project must end by the beginning of September of 2023, we can go ahead and do that. And so now whenever we're essentially creating a boundary that this project must start within, and you won't be able to go outside that boundary unless you were to remove the constraint by double clicking on it. And so that is all the options within the Gant view up above when it comes to actually clicking into the bar and then expanding, compressing, or shifting the project dates. However, you do have a handful of options that are very useful as well when you go through a couple things. So over here on the left, we have we'll see a multitude of different options. And the ones that we're going to focus on today will be the exclude, opportunity map, as well as lock. So something we didn't cover, but is happening in my screen right now, is we do have project one up above, which is currently excluded, which essentially means the information can be modified, it can't be interacted with. However, it's just being excluded at this point in time. So the allocation option, allocation up above, is not really being represented down below. It's just representing as a bar and will be represented if you choose to include it back in. And so we can do that with any of the projects down below by selecting on the blue option and selecting exclude, essentially excluding this information, and we would see that change down below within the allocation grid. So once you exclude a project, or maybe even if the project is included, a very particularly useful option that you do have is this opportunity map. And this can be useful first when you have new projects that are excluded. You have a kind of a baseline of when maybe that project will start, or maybe just a baseline of the information that you know, or the amount of work that is needed for that given project. However, you don't really have an idea of when that will start. The opportunity map will be a great tool for the user to be able to go through and actually see some potential areas where this project may be able to start. So I'm going to select an opportunity map. And when I do so, what's going to happen is it's going to bring me up a view showing me with some potential times that this project can start. So a lot of things going on here. And the first thing I want to start with up here is this 19%. And essentially what this is saying is it's went through, looked at the capacity of the resources that are assigned to this project, and then started calculating out how much time, or essentially at what points in time do these resources assigned to this project actually have some time to work on this project. And this is saying essentially over the entire duration of this project, 19% of your resources, or the capacity that you're looking for, can be accomplished here. So maybe not the best case scenario to start this project. We may have to increase the duration over here to see if there's any more scenarios, but it really doesn't look like it. So it may just be we need to increase the amount of capacity we have, or maybe reprioritize particular projects within here. However, this is just saying that we have that 19%, and we can go ahead and click on this option one to see what that new distribution of the hours would essentially be. So you do have two options here. One is by default, it's going to be showing you your named resources. It's also going to be trying to calculate the most amount of a capacity that you have available to receive. However, you can decrease this. So say if you wanted some more options and you want to say, okay, if I have resources available at some point in time over that duration for 14% of the time instead of that 19, you can see we have a multitude of different options now available instead of just the two. As well as you can choose to work with more at an aggregate level instead of a named individual. Maybe you're more so just focused on, I want to make sure that this department has the capacity instead of the resource. Maybe the resource is not as important to what's being worked on. It's more the aggregate level. We can essentially redistribute or reassign the work to another user in that aggregate instead. And if that's the case, you can change it to this resource aggregate. You can see that looks a little bit better. Now we have one option available if we start on October 1st, 2021. and we're getting 35% based off of the aggregate as itself, or as a whole's capacity instead of the individual resource. So if we go in here and select on option 1, we can then start seeing what that would look like, the availability of the different aggregates, in this case department over here. And then you can also see kind of a before and after of what the changes would look like if they were to go through. So we can go over here to the right. We can see before in January 22nd, it would have been essentially negative, or essentially the availability is negative 1,327.89 hours. Then after we have the negative 1,324. As well as if you want to see this more as the allocation percentage instead of the availability, you can go ahead and do that, and you can see what those changes will look like, more so based off of the percentage of allocation assigned. So if you go through here, you're seeing these changes, you drill in to see, okay, this is what they're also be working on, and everything looks good. You can go ahead and actually just apply these changes up above. And by doing so, you will see that this change has been made, and you will also see the changes reflected down below. So the opportunity map is a great tool to allow you to see the different options that you have available when proposing a new project, or maybe even an existing project. You want to see, well, we need to shift this project start date to something else, and see what that would look like instead. So very useful for determining new start dates for projects and where things may fit at a very high level, and having a tool to assist you with that. Okay, so I'm going to go over here to the blue button, and the last option I just want to make sure we cover is this lock option. And this is just very nice scenario when you know something is locked in place, you know you can't change it, and you can go ahead and see, okay, well, this is locked, information still being accounted for, you just can't really move it whatsoever. It's just going to be locked in place, just to make sure that maybe this is a project that needs to happen from these two certain dates. Maybe this is a project you don't even include in the model itself. Maybe it would be a project that you bring over as unsimulated because you know you're not going to make any changes, as well as is a good way to essentially, as you're working through, you're making your changes. Locking something will allow you to make sure that you just don't accidentally move it, or if an error happens, you don't move a project out that shouldn't be moved. Okay, and so what I'm going to do now is up here in the top right, I'm going to select on this option and up here, which is going to actually allow us to regroup some of our bars within here. And before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and just unlock this once more. So I'm going to unlock this project. And up here is another really useful option, especially when you're trying to group together your projects. And so this option is going to be a strategic roll-up, which will allow you to essentially roll up your projects by one of your project attributes within the system. So in this case, I have 4 or 5 or so different options. We can do it by the phase, the project manager, the senior leader, and essentially determine where those projects fall, as well as you also have options to exclude all these projects within here. So let's say in this case, we have all our projects, and we want to see, okay, well, we have 13 high, 14 low, and 13 medium. What would it look like if we had to remove all of our low projects from this duration? How does that impact our resource allocation, as well as does it make things look better down below and something that is more achievable? So instead of having to go through and actually individually say, let's exclude this project here that has a priority of low and this project here, you can use the strategic roll up to essentially say, okay, I want to exclude all my low projects, and go here, click on that blue button and hit exclude. So as I do so, you can see a drastic change in my heat map down below. My allocation percentage is looking a little bit better, still a little bit more under allocated over here on the left, and then over here on the right, but the middle looks much better than it was before, where we were seeing those kind of different shades of orange and red showing really high percentages of allocation. And then from there, then you can start and even prioritize what some of those low projects you want to include in. So you can see we can still see all of our projects that we just excluded, and you can choose to insert a couple more and start including some of the more important ones that you may be able to prioritize more so than the other ones. So let's say we wanted to bring in Aurora phase 15, we can choose to include it. It's added in here. Maybe we wanted to include Canary phase 3. And we can go ahead and maybe include Indigo Phase 8. So as we include them, you can see them being added back in the model. We still have many of these excluded, but overall our model, at least, we still are a little bit under allocated in 2021. Maybe some additional projects could have been added, and we're still under allocated in 2022 and 2023. So as more projects come in, we can definitely add more, and we definitely have the availability to work for those. But down below, you can at least see in the middle of here that we're looking much better, around that 100% mark of our resources, and we can definitely add some additional projects, or there's also the scenario to potentially remove capacity of your resources instead to see if there aren't those additional projects that need to be added. So last thing I want to mention on this side up above is this would be the perfect case for when you'd want to use that opportunity map. So instead of just inserting the projects in, including them back in with where they were initially planned, you can use that opportunity map to then get an understanding, okay, when can this project start? Maybe I want to go from throughout the entire duration. Maybe I wanted to see if when I can start this project from just after 2022. So I can click in here and let's say from the 1st of 2022 to the beginning of 2024, see where we can potentially start that. We can do it at an individual resource level, and we can say we can get 67% of the capacity that is being asked for, and we can see what those changes would look like. Or we can even choose to do this at that aggregate level. We can see actually 99% of the allocation or the aggregates during those times have some sort of allocation within there. We can see what those changes would look like over here. And I'll change just the allocation percentage. And then we can see that they would still be under allocated. It's just maybe a better representation or a better place to start this project if you have the ability to start at that point in time. So I'm going to go ahead, click on option 1. I'll go ahead and apply that, and then we've included that back in. So you'll have those different options to go through when you can start some of those projects, start working with them. Once you start maybe potentially excluding them if your project, if you're over allocated, or maybe increasing the capacity as well. So outside of the top side of the screen with the Gant bars and the model we're looking at, the bottom is going to be that representation of your allocation, and it's just me showing if your resources are over or under allocated during those given times. So just a high level overview of what this grid is doing. Essentially, we're breaking out the information at that aggregate level based off the configuration. So we have our different departments in this case of accounting and finance, human resource management, marketing, production, purchasing, and resource and development. And then you can see at a aggregate level how allocated are these departments and if they're over or under. And in this case, many of them are around the 95 to 105%, which is usually pretty good. You're maybe a little over or under, but definitely something you can work with. But before, when we had everything included, you could see that we were in more of the 130s, 140s, which may mean that you need to hire some additional resources. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and run through, and I'm going to include all these back in. So I'm going to go to low, I'll exclude them once more, and include them back all into there, and get that heat map that we previously saw. And we can see, okay, let me go ahead and go back here. We can see some potential problems within here. And if you want to isolate where those problems are, for instance, on February 22nd, and the marketing team is going to be 152% allocated, that's something that we may not want. So we can go ahead and click in here to actually see the particular projects that are causing this. So we can go ahead, we can look at the information, we can group this or sort this by hours to see which projects themselves are taking up the most time. And you can see in this case, they're all relatively around the same, between maybe 130 and 190 hours. And then if we want, we can actually, if we want to start making changes to some of these, we can actually just click on here, which will then swiftly move the top grid to that project. We can interact with it, and then you can actually start making some of those changes. Maybe this is something that needs to be excluded. Maybe we need to shift the project start date back, and then we can see those changes that are happening down below and see the updates that have happened. And so as you go through that, we can we can see that at the aggregate level. We can also expand it out if we're more so interested in maybe in the resources themselves. And then we can say, okay, well, let's look for individual resources that are having issues. We can see Colin McAuliffe right here is having some issues. He's at 198. Jack Pierce is 199. So there's just too much work being assigned to this resource. And we can try to rectify that by potentially moving some of the projects out during those different time frames that kind of satisfy some of those requests. So we can maybe say Odyssey Phase 17, and let's just ship this way out. And by doing so, we can now see Jack, at least in February, is now 154% instead of that 200 that we were previously seeing. So a little bit better, but he's still over allocated. And you'd have to go through a couple more of these iterations, probably isolating and identifying some of these projects to change. Maybe Astro Phase 7. Looks like even if we move this, it probably will still impact that same time frame. You could always shorten it. You could always change the amount of work. If that project needs less work, you can always go ahead and run through some of those scenarios, as well as maybe there's the case where, well, everything that is happening in this case is important. We need to make sure that these activities are being ran, and we need the amount this work to happen, and we really don't have the capability, or we really can't justify moving out these projects. And if that's the case, you always do have an option to increase the amount of capacity that is being represented within a model as well. So let's say for in this case, we're looking at marketing, and we can see it looks like everywhere from October 2021 out into July 22nd, we're over allocated, and we may just need to add some additional headcount overall to this particular department. So if we hover over here to the marketing side of things, and we see this edit icon, that's going to allow you to actually increase as well as decrease the amount of capacity that is associated at that aggregate level, in this case, the marketing department. So over here, we can see it looks like it's really from October 21 to May 22nd is when we need some additional capacity. And let's go ahead and add some additional resources to see how that impacts our overall view. So I'll change this calendar to be October 1st, 2021, and then I'll have the end date of these resources be May 31st, 2022. 2022, go to May, and go here. So we're looking to add some additional resources between this time frame, and let's say we wanted to add 3 resources here with 8 hours per day. So you can go ahead and just hit apply. That'll make the change, and then you can see what that looks like. However, we do have this update preview, which will essentially just mock up what that would look like. And what I'd primarily focus on here is the resource information will essentially stay exactly the same. However, at this aggregate level is where you'll be seeing some of those changes. So you can see, if we scroll down below, we can see when that capacity is added right here. So between October 21 and May 22nd. And then up above, you can see that this is drastically changed from that 109. We can see we have 127 is looking at 109 now. We have 130 for November, which is 112, 117 down to 100%. So by adding just those 3 additional resources, you definitely can see that impact of how your overall capacity for that at that aggregate level has changed, and it's definitely looking better than it previously was. So just to make sure everyone's aware, so you can increase that at a individual resource level, as well as you can always do it by percentage as well. Maybe you want to increase the overall capacity of this department by, let's say, 20% instead of just adding 3 resources. You can go ahead and update that preview, see the changes that happen from that time frame. So we'll scroll down and find that same October 21. And now you can see the before and after does look still better than it previously was with 20%. And then we'd see that capacity down below associated to this generic marketing resource. So very useful if you need to see, maybe you're looking at staffing, you need to try to identify how many more particular types of this resource that we may need to hire to kind of satisfy all the project and all the information, all the projects that are being worked on. And you can kind of see that, as well as you can go in the reverse fashion where, well, maybe we're anticipating a this load of projects, or maybe we're anticipating a decrease in this particular department's staff by maybe we're cutting 20%, or maybe we'll be losing these particular resources. You can also run through that scenario and see what that will look like, how that would overall impact your portfolio, and maybe then start adapting to some of those issues. So in this case, let's say we were going to be decreasing the marketing department by 20%. We can update that preview, and this would be 20% overall. And we can see that we're going to be in a worse place than we previously were. Or let me update that preview once more. And then down below, let's scroll over to October. And now you can see we're in a worse position than we were before. Well, but that may just be something that you need to run the scenario for. You're looking at this and we're anticipating that, and then start, after that change, start going through some of the projects up above, really prioritizing what projects you need. You do have the capability to run some of these or add some of your attributes. Maybe you wanted to focus on priority and start going through what that would look like. Okay, these particular projects are low, like we saw before. Exclude some of those, see how that impacts everything that's going on. And then as you exclude some of those, see what that how that is impacting, see if it's a better or worse, and we still see marketing's bad and very over allocated. You can still go through and start looking at some of those projects, identifying if they need to be changed, and make those changes accordingly until you get to that kind of particular amount of allocation percentage that you're looking for. So as we've been going through some of these changes, going through some of these different scenarios where we're increasing the capacity, shifting the projects, including excluding certain projects from the model, we have been primarily focused on this heat map view. However, one of the views I do want to kind of draw attention to is this delta view, which is also very useful, especially when you're primarily focusing on changes. The heat map is good when you have that overall view. You want to see everything that's happening, but what if you want to only focus on kind of changes that are happening to particular aggregates or resources themselves? You can easily do that by selecting on the delta view, which is more so now going to represent when you have, or only going to be showing you or highlighting the particular rows and columns that have changed when a change is made. So in this case, if I were to go and move this project Odyssey face to the left, instead of focusing on every row that has changed and every resource that has changed, we'd simply only be focusing on the resources themselves and aggregates that have changed due to that project being moved out. So it is very useful, really helps you isolate and kind of tune out some of the information that may not have changed, may not be as important when you're analyzing this information. However, and more so, I guess, display just the changes that are happening. And there are some cool features in regards to this delta view. If you select on this little cog icon over here to the left, you can see we can change this to show our baseline change, the net availability of our resources, only our named resources, as well as one that I particularly like is the show change rows only, which is really just going to focus on the changed rows from or the rows that have changed due to a project being shifted, compressed, or expanded. So if I move this over to the right, we can see that. And then we're really only going to be focusing on the named individuals. All those kind of all of the resources that were not updated are essentially just removed from the view. And then we can really focus on those particular changes themselves down below. Okay, and then the last options I want to cover today that can be useful when running through those scenarios is up here in the top for resource. And this is just going to show you the resource grid, give you that nice roll up and actually, roll up at a resource or project level and drill down into the actual allocation that is being assigned or being displayed within here at that project as well as assignment level. So you can go ahead and use this view to get some of that information if you need to essentially spot check something particularly, or you can also use it to replace some of the information within here. So what this is going to be doing, and you can add a heat map up here, is just showing you a resource level as well as a project level if you like, right up here. and I'll stay on resource for now. Essentially, this is going to show you what they're assigned to on those given days, how much allocation they actually have, as well as you can drill down, see the projects they're working on, and then at the bottom level, actually see the assignments and actually replace some of the information on those assignments to different resources. So just before we go into this, I just want to reiterate this point that I talked about earlier is this is going to be replaced in the sense of the model. It's not going to impact your live data. So there are times where I recommend, well, if a lot of things need to be changed, it may be do better to make those changes directly in the project once you know kind of what those changes will be instead of within the model, just because since that replace does not take place, you would still have to make that replacement within here. It really depends. One off or a couple replacements is fine, but if you plan on replacing all the information on a project, it may be better to directly do that within Tempus instead of the model itself, and then have that import that or that data then be brought back into the model just to save yourself a little bit of time instead of having to go through and make those changes essentially twice. So it is inevitably up to the user themselves and what they're ultimately trying to do. But just a recommendation that if there's multiple or a lot of changes that are happening, a lot of changes on the replacement side of things happening, you may want to do those in the project and then see what that correlates out to in the model, especially for proposed projects or new projects that have not been started yet. But with that being said, I do want to, so if you ever do need to replace some of the hours, maybe you want to update directly and see, well, maybe we have to drastically increase the hours on this project or for a particular month, or maybe remove that, see what that and see what that change will look like. You can navigate to this view, and if you single or double click on any of these cells, you can actually directly update it if it's at that assignment level and see what that change would look like. And then we'd also see what that change reflects to down below from our Delta view, as well as if you single click, you do have replacement options. And you can go through and essentially replace the allocation that is assigned to, in this case, Abigail Wells, to a new resource. So down below, we can see that availability or an allocation percentages of our resources. And by default, it's going to be showing you resources based off of the aggregate that you have selected. And in this case, it's resource and development because that's where Abigail Wells belongs to. But you can change this to any of these different available options, or you can even change the aggregates that they're working on. The system's just trying to essentially associate it to a similar department or aggregate based off of essentially an assumption, because if they belong to the same aggregate, it's probably going to be similar work. So in this case, we can see over here, Abigail Wells, between this time frame, we would have to find a resource that maybe has some availability. And if we look down below, we can see, well, Caroline is looking pretty good over here, a little bit under allocated towards the end, some more work, but is looking better than some of the other options. We can either choose to fully replace the allocation being asked for or doing a partial replace. In this case, I just want to do a full replace. So I'll select on Caroline, hit apply changes. Now you have the ability to actually choose how you want to distribute this information. In this case, since it's just one resource, it's going to distribute it all to Caroline. But if you had multiple selected, let's say, for example, we had Caroline as well as Abigail, and we hit apply changes, you can choose if you want to distribute this, this allocation equally over the same duration. You can choose to split the allocation up by moving the sliders and changing the dates. So we could do something along this lines where the first half of the assignment is assigned to Abigail, and then the second half is to Caroline. And the only thing to be aware of here is it does need to equal out to the entirety of the hours being asked for, in this case 1,994, as well as you do have to have a concurrent time frame being specified. So in this case, if I were to move this over, you can see that between September 8th, 2022 and the 27th of September 2022, we have nothing assigned, and we'll just have to satisfy that request. I'll move this over, as well as if you really wanted to get complicated with it and really start moving over some of the allocation, you want to even split out the allocation more between separate time frames, you can have multiple instances of Caroline or Abigail in this case, and actually redistribute the hours differently between Caroline. So maybe we needed Caroline to take the first part of this project, and I'll move this over to the left. we need to have Abigail take the second part, and then we want to then shift it back to Caroline at the end. You can do something like that to satisfy that request as well. And then lastly, if you want those changes to go through, we just hit apply, and then we'd see those changes down below and see what the impact of those changes would be. Okay, so there's one last option I want to cover within here. And this is one of the options we do typically recommend, and it does kind of live within this configuration. And you'd have to enable it to have this logic kind of flow through, and that is this proposal logic. So as you continue to use Tempus, there's always going to be new projects flowing into the system, essentially allowing you to, and then with the dynamic project inclusion, automatically being added into the model itself. And so as you go through that process, it can be very important to make sure that one of the projects that are being added, depending on how you do kind of your planning, if they are proposed projects or something you maybe aren't completely aware are going to be happening, you can always mark them as proposed, and then within the model itself, use that information to automatically exclude that particular project within here. So what exactly does that mean? So I do have my proposal logic enabled. I'm going to go through here. I'm going to hit edit, or I'm going to click on the model itself actually. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove all my changes that have happened. And then up above, let's see, go back here, make sure proposal, change that, edit this once more. So I should have project one up here at the top. There we go. So let me remove this right here. There we go. So we have project one. So over here on the left, we have this P icon, which is showing as proposed. So this is a potentially new project we're working through. We want to work on it, but maybe we don't particularly know when it should start. So we have some generic time over here on the right. It's starting on the 1st of January 2022, ends on January 4th, and we want to see potentially when this project could be started within here. However, we have yet to include it. So when you have that proposed logic enabled, and you actually are using the is proposed field within a project, essentially it's going to be excluded initially by default. Make sure it's not impacting your model, and then you can use the opportunity map as well as include options to determine when you may want to add that project in here. So let me go ahead and I'm going to navigate back to SuperGrid here. Let's open another tab of it. And I'm going to update my project one that was added. Okay, go ahead, open that up. And I'm just going to change the end date within here. And I will set that to 2021 or 2022, approve that shift. And then I'm also going to add another project in here, regular project. I'll name this one project 2. And I'm going to also make sure I have this is proposal flag associated with the project set to yes. Lastly, I'm going to go ahead, let's say this is a project it's going to start in July of 2022, and then it's going to end in October, the end of October. And let me go ahead and make sure I select the right dates, so 2022. And then I'm going to assign some resources down below and apply some planned allocation to them. So let's say we're going to need 1 FTE of this for Audrey's time, 0.5 and 0.75 of Ashley's. Throughout the entire duration, I'll copy that over and just create that. So with that created, and let me go ahead and actually, real quick, also add a phase to this. So say the current phase is in phase 2. Go ahead and save. And so with that added, we should see that automatically be brought back into our model since we have that dynamic project inclusion option enabled. So we'll just give it a second. There can typically be around a minute or so delay before when live data gets added and updated to when it's actually reflected in the model. So it'll just take a second or so for that to load up. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and open the model up once more. Still is loading, so we'll just give it a couple more seconds or so. And there we go. We have the project 2 and project 1. These are the proposed projects. So we started to fill them out. Maybe we started using generic resources in this case. So maybe instead of the named resources that I used, I put some generics just so we have a rough understanding of what is needed for this project. And now we have it in here. Now we have to try to identify when this potentially can start. And then we can definitely use the options such as include or opportunity map. So say we want to see, maybe we want a good opportunity for project 2 to start this. Well, we can see if we were to go from today out until the 1st of 2024, we could get 59% of the resources based on the named level. But if I were to choose the aggregate level, we actually have 3 options here when our resources would have some sort of allocation during that given time periods that are asked. So we'd be able to essentially allocate or assign these projects to any of these 3 days, and we'd have the capacity that we're looking for. And then you can determine which one of those options would be the best fit. Let's say it was option 3 to have it start on the 1st of September 2023. We can see what that change would look like, how much availability of those particular aggregates that we have, hit apply, include that, and actually see that data reflected over here on the right. And the same thing can be done with any of your proposed projects up here. So we go through the same steps with project 1, choose the opportunity map, we can choose the aggregate level, and we can see at most we can get 85%, which seems pretty good on starting this project on the 1st of January of 2023. Go ahead and click that, see what the before and after would be due to this change, and then go ahead and apply that change within here. So this is an option that I highly recommend using, especially if you're going through planning, you're proposing particular projects, and then want to see, and maybe you're unsure of when the projects can actually start or when you have those availability. It's a very quick and easy way for you to add those proposed projects in, get a nice high-level overview of your entire portfolio, and then use the opportunity map to start identifying potential start dates for this, just based off of the amount of work overall that you would need for this project. Okay, so with that being said, I know it's we still have 20 or so minutes available for this. However, that is the bulk of the material that I was looking to cover today.